Shalom, shalom. It is April 5th, Sunday, April 5th, 2015. It is the Feast of Firstfruits, or the Feast of the Bikurim. This is Sunday. It's the Sunday that falls within the 7 days of Passover, or the 7 days of unleavened bread. Of course, the first day of unleavened bread started yesterday on April 4th, extends through the 7th day of unleavened bread, which will be April 10th this year. And we read in Leviticus that the morrow after the Sabbath, within the 7 days of unleavened bread, is known as the Feast of the Firstfruits. You can find it in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 9 through 14. And it says, And Yahweh spake unto Moshe, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When ye be come into the land which I give unto you, and shall reap the harvest thereof, then ye shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest unto the priest. And he shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath the priest shall wave it. And ye shall offer that day, when ye wave the sheaf, an he lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering unto Yahweh. And the meat offering thereof shall be 2/10 deals of fine flour mingled with oil, an offering made by fire unto Yahweh for a sweet savor. And the drink offering thereof shall be of wine the 4th part of an hin. And ye shall eat neither bread nor parched corn nor green ears until the selfsame day that ye have brought an offering unto your Yah. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. And then you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the Sabbath of the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days. Which goes on into Pentecost or Shavuot. So we see here that we had Passover, which was on Friday, April the 3rd. We had the Passover dinner as commanded in Exodus 12 on Friday evening, April 3rd, as Passover transitioned to the first day of unleavened bread. We started the first day of unleavened bread this year on April 4th, which was yesterday, and for 7 days we eat nothing with leaven in, symbolizing the purity of Yahshua. And on the morrow after the Sabbath, within the 7 days of unleavened bread, which is today, Sunday, is the Feast of the Bikurim, or the Feast of Firstfruits. This is where all the children of Israel, having come up to the Feast of Passover in Jerusalem, they have already harvested their very first harvest of the year, which is the early spring harvest. It's the barley harvest. Remember, the new year cannot begin until all the barley within the land of Israel is Aviv, because the children of Israel have to be able to harvest their barley, and they have to bring the first fruits, or the first shock of their barley harvest, up with them to the Feast of Passover when they come up to Jerusalem. And once they get up to Passover, on the day of the first fruits, which this year is from Saturday night, April 4th, until Sunday night, April 5th, or today, Sunday, they would bring up their shock of their first fruits of the barley harvest to the temple, and the high priest would then take a shock of the shocks of these barley harvests and wave them all day before Yahweh in the holy place. Of course, there's a lot of references to the Feast of Firstfruits in the Brit Hadashah, in the Renewed Covenant. Paul makes several references in 1 Corinthians, where he says that Christ, he has become the first fruit from among the dead. He was the first one to rise up and pave the way for the rest of us to have a resurrection ourselves. James talks about how we will be made a kind of firstfruits when we get resurrected, or as the Christians say, rapture. Because Yahshua became the first fruit from among the dead, he rose first, we get to join with him later. First fruits is also directly connected to the next spring feast that will happen after the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover week is over, which will be the Feast of Shavuot. This year it happens, I believe it's May the 24th or May the 25th, around there. Anyway, it's exactly 50 days after today. Today starts day 1, you count 50 days, or 7 Sabbaths, and then the day after the Sabbath, or the next Sunday, is the Feast of Shavuot. So this feast is directly connected to the Feast of Shavuot. I actually have an article about that on the website. So the Feast of Firstfruits, unlike the first day of unleavened bread, and unlike the 7th day of unleavened bread, the Feast of Firstfruits is not a Sabbath. It's not a high Sabbath. You can work on this day. It's a work day. And yet, the Feast of Firstfruits is very significant. Now, most people, Christians, are ignorantly celebrating Easter Sunday, which, of course, Easter comes from Ishtar. It's pagan. It has nothing to do with Yahshua resurrecting from the grave. But today, really, in actual fact, biblically, is not Easter Sunday or even Resurrection Sunday. It is the Feast of Firstfruits. It's the Ascension Firstfruits, if you want to really get technical about it. Because when Yahshua was crucified, he was crucified on a Wednesday. He was laid in the tomb Wednesday at twilight before the high Sabbath began, the first day of unleavened bread. And he was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. So he was in the grave on Wednesday night, Thursday night, and Friday night. And he was in the grave all day Thursday, which would have been the first day of unleavened bread, all day Friday, and all day Saturday. 3 days and 3 nights. But he couldn't have been in there Saturday night because that would have been more than 3 days and 3 nights. So he must have risen on twilight Saturday. So it was actually Resurrection Shabbat, Resurrection Sabbath, not Resurrection Sunday. So he rose yesterday at twilight. And then the following day is when the women, of course, discovered that the tomb was empty. And they discovered that Yahshua had already risen. And so this is the day of the firstfruits. Now, just as the high priest would take those shocks of barley from everyone that had brought up their first fruit barley harvest and would wave them before Yahweh in the holy place, so too Yahshua, on the day of the firstfruits, after he had already risen from the grave at the end of the Sabbath the day before, he would now ascend up to the Father and wave himself as a first fruit from among the dead, just as the high priest was waving the barley. And the high priest, as long as he was in the process of taking these shocks of the first fruit barleys from everyone and waving them in the holy place, he could not allow anyone to be touched. He could not allow anyone to touch him. Because if, say, maybe a woman who was on her period or whatever happened to touch him, or maybe a man who had had sexual intercourse with his wife happened to touch him, he would be unclean and he wouldn't be able to go into the holy place. So no one was permitted to touch the high priest while he was in the process of gathering these first fruits of barley shocks from the people and waving them before Yahweh. In the same way, if you remember the story of Miriam at the tomb that morning of the first fruits, and she discovered the tomb was empty, Yahshua appeared to her and asked her why she was weeping. And at first, she thought he was the gardener, and then he realized it was Yahshua, and she was overcome with emotion, and so she reached forward to embrace him, and Yahshua stepped back and said, "Wait, don't touch me yet. I have not yet ascended unto my Father." So just as the high priest couldn't be touched until he had finished the process of waving all the first fruit barley shocks in the holy place, so too Yahshua could not be touched because he had not yet ascended. But of course, later that day on the Feast of First Fruits, to fulfill the Feast of First Fruits, he did in fact ascend up to the Father, and he waved himself as a first fruit offering. He had been in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. He had risen at the end of Sabbath, Resurrection Shabbat, and the next day, which is today, the Feast of First Fruits, he waved himself as a first fruit resurrection. So, in any case, this is a very important day because it does mark not only when the resurrection was discovered. Keep in mind, the resurrection happened on Shabbat, which was yesterday. But today is the day when the resurrection was discovered by the women and then by the disciples. And it's also the day that Yahshua waved himself before the Father, just as the high priest was waving those shocks of barley in the holy temple on the same day. This is the day he fulfilled that feast and waved himself. He became the first fruit from among the dead, which, of course, would pave the way for us to become a kind of first fruits, as James talks about, when we will be raptured in the fulfillment of the Feast of Trumpets, which happens in the fall. So this is a very important day, even though it's not a Shabbat, even though it's a work day. It is a very important day to remember and to understand what was actually fulfilled and done on this day. A most joyous day, as we know now that Yahshua has truly risen. Hallelujah. Shalom, shalom. Happy Feast of the Bikurim. Happy Feast of First Fruits, and happy second day of Unleavened Bread 2015.